Hola, buenas tardes. Haré la introducción en español porque nuestro invitado lo entiende, pero luego el resto del acto será en inglés. Pues muchas gracias en nombre de la Fundación Mies van der Rohe por haber venido hoy a esta conferencia de Raymond Richard Neutra con motivo de la próxima reedición del mítico libro Survival Through Design, que originalmente publicó su padre, Richard Neutra, en 1954. Estamos contentos porque este libro y esta conferencia, imagino, y lo que nos contará, destaca la intersección de la arquitectura, la biología, el diseño, todos estos temas centrales del legado Neutra y muy importantes otra vez hoy. Richard Neutra lo conocen, fue un influyente arquitecto moderno del movimiento moderno austríaco-estadounidense, reconocido por integrar consideraciones sobre salud, bienestar y medio ambiente en sus proyectos arquitectónicos.
Kind of radical modernism which had a functional relationship between indoors and outdoors. It isn't only looking at it, but setting it up in such a way that it was a seamless flow back and forth. So the two of them then designed this reinforced concrete apartment house completed in 1928, and this photograph was taken by Walter Gropius when he visited Los Angeles in 1928. And then the two of them made a presentation in the concurso of the League of Nations. My father was working with young architects, thinking up all kinds of programs for dealing with airplanes and trains and streetcars and cars, how to integrate all these things. And in this 5-year period, he wrote 2 books about America, one about the technology, the other about the economic and social forces that influence the style of American architecture. And then at the end of the 5 years, of course, he designed the Lovell Health House, which was also a school. And if you want to hear about those 5 years in the relationship between my father and Mr. Wright, I've written this book both in Spanish, translated by my cousin, Irina Soslavsky, who was here earlier and had to leave, or in English. And there's both hard copies and digital copies at Amazon if you're interested. So that's the end of the first chapter. We're going to have a number of events in Los Angeles celebrating this, a documentary film about Gal Kashire, an art dealer that my father built a house for in that era, talks about what Schindler and Neutra did in those 5 years, and another one about co-living then and now, because Schindler's house originally was designed with the idea of a shared kitchen between himself and his friend. So, chapter 2, people always ask me, what was it like to grow up with this character? And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. First of all, this was an unusual place that I grew up in, built in 1932. It's on a 60 by 70 foot lot and was to accommodate 3 households plus a small architectural office. And really, the Neutra family was an immigrant family, and as is the case with immigrants, everybody chips in the business. And my part in this was to take the people who showed up several times a week from Brazil or Spain or Japan or Germany who wanted to see the house. And so I would take them around, and I would push this big sliding glass door open to impress them, or I would fold this door here on the second floor that opened onto a balcony. And this was my favorite thing to do. This was a garage door. And so you could whack it with your hip and it would flip open, and suddenly there was this garden there. So there's a lot of kinetic memories, memorias kinéticas of this experience. Then there was an unusual cast of characters here. Most children have mommy and daddy and brothers. But in addition, upstairs we had Frank Wilkinson and his wife and baby, and he was the founder of social housing in Los Angeles. And then down in the basement garage, converted garage room, there were apprentices, people that I've known my entire life. This was Charlie Bello then and Charlie Bello now. He lives in a forest in Northern California. He's cut all the lumber. He's built all of this by hand, and is a sculptor as well. And then Erich Schneider-Wessling, who then became a distinguished German architect and professor in Munich and in Cologne. And then we had a colorful cook who was also a singer and a yoga practitioner, as you would expect in cooks in Los Angeles, right? Now, when I was this age, it was my job to walk from this lower area across the patio up into that studio where my father had been working since 4 o'clock in the morning. He was sitting on a tall metal stool and preparing work for the architects who would come in at 8 o'clock. And the architects were from many countries. So the man to the far left of the picture is Benno Fischer, a Jewish-Polish architect who still had the tattoo from Auschwitz on his arm. And over near the window standing is Sergei Koshin, who was a Russian architect who showed Le Corbusier around Moscow in 1930. And then the one in between is my much older brother. He was 12 years older than I. So by the time I was 10, he was 22. And of course, you see my father. And then one of the architects tried to figure out who sat where, and if you look at the names, there are people from Venezuela, from Switzerland, from Germany, from China, and so forth. So it was a colorful character of people that I wandered around as a kid in this office. And then it was my job to go along with Julius Schulman and my father taking photographs. And it was my job to push the owner's furniture out of the picture and put some Neutra furniture there that this gentleman here showed me a bunch of models that he had. And sometimes I would be a model. That's me in that picture of the Channel Heights social housing project. Then there were the circle of people known to my parents. When I was 5, coming back from the East Coast, we stayed at Taliesin East, and I have images of Frank Lloyd Wright at a little picnic next to a river and playing at Taliesin with another little boy who told me to be careful of the big pot that was on an outdoor pedestal because Mrs. Wright would spank me if it was to be broken. Charles and Ray Eames were good friends of the family. Mies van der Rohe played an important role in my father's life when my father was lecturing in Berlin in 1930. Mies invited him to teach at the Bauhaus for 2 weeks. And when Mies first arrived in New York, my father happened to be there and welcomed him. And there was a continuous connection. I actually got to meet Mies at the end of his life. And he was living not in a Mies building, but in a more traditional building, and was in a wheelchair. And there was very little furniture in this apartment. And I had the fantasy that Mies would say less is more, and then wheel his chair to the other corner and look back at the empty room. I also got to meet Walter Gropius towards the end of his life when I was studying epidemiology in Harvard. And I had lunch with him and told him about my work as a medical doctor on the Navajo reservation. And he said, you know, I used to go all the time to ride horses in Arizona in the summertime. And I said, oh, did you come to visit Los Angeles? He said, no, I haven't been there since 1928. Which I thought was interesting. Rafael Soriano was a friend, scientists like Hans Selye, the discoverer of the stress syndrome, and then Schindler himself. There had been an estrangement between Schindler and my father, partly due to the fact that Schindler had not been included in the 1932 international style MoMA exhibition, which was so important. And partly because he basically disagreed with that whole approach to architecture. But my father had a heart attack and he was wheeled into a room, and there was Schindler, who was dying from cancer. And they had kind of a rapprochement there, and I remember meeting Schindler at that time. Then there were the clients. This is a client conference in the living room of the house that I grew up in, and I would eavesdrop on those conferences and got to know some of the clients. John Nesbitt was a colorful character who had radio shows and was quite prominent in the late 40s. But in 1942, my father built this house for him, which was the beginning of a loosening up of California modern. Then there was the tele-evangelist, Robert Schuller, for whom my father designed a drive-in church. I'm not sure how many drive-in churches you have in Catalunya, but in California, people would come and drive on Sunday to, originally he started his ministry at a drive-in church, which is a drive-in movie place. Did you ever have drive-in movies here? No, probably not. Well, the idea was that there would be a big space with a big screen outside, and you would drive in files, which were a little bit slanted, and there would be microphones that you would open the window and hear the movie. And so on Sundays, he preached from the top of the projection booth to people, and then he decided he would have a church that would be designed for this. And so this was designed in such a way that he, Schuller, could talk either to the people inside or to the people outside through the mic. So and they could see him there on this projecting place. So can you believe it that the Catholic Church now owns this church? They don't have drive-in anymore, but they did a beautiful job in restoring both that big tower and this building. So those were colorful clients. But then this gentleman here built his own house out in Lone Pine, California, with these beautiful rocks. And he was a very simple character. He had actually survived the attack on Pearl Harbor, where he was a sailor. He came back and moved up to the desert and was a county official. And at lunchtime, he always ordered in magazines or books from nearby city libraries, and always liked to look at architecture. And either, if he liked it, it was either Frank Lloyd Wright or my father. So he wrote a letter to my father showing photographs of these big rocks in the mountains, and said, this is how much money I have, would you consider designing a house for me? And my father fell in love with this and designed a house, and that Mr. Euler built himself. And then they became friends. They were Mormons, and they would go to Salt Lake City at Christmas time, and they invited my parents to come and stay while they were gone, and then they would overlap. And there's a very beautiful movie made by the grandson of Mr. Euler about that house and the relationship. And this ballet dancer in Bakersfield, California, and her husband built this house for themselves. So there was a whole range of clients. Now, of course, the most famous client is Edgar Kaufman, who also owned Falling Water, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. And these are the client notes in my father's hand of the first meeting when he showed the preliminary drawings. And Mr. Kaufman wanted to have sliding doors that met at the corner. And so this is what he got. And you can see from the outside how radical this is. Now, a mere 2 months later, the working drawings were ready, and there was a catastrophe. In those days, you sent your hand-drawn drawings to a blueprint company, and a man on a motorcycle would come and collect the things and bring them to the blueprint company. But on that day, 2 months from the day that this conference about the sliding doors, the guy arrived and there was no drawings in his pack. Somehow they had fallen out. Now, I was 10 years old at that time, and if I'd made my bed and taken the basura out to the garbage can, my father would do a drawing for me. And my mother told me not to bother my father because there was big brouhaha going on about this thing. But I was 10 years old and I asked. And so he sat down and drew this picture of the offending blueprint man and his thing. Well, luckily the next day someone called up and saw the name and the phone number, and the thing was sent off and the house got built. A year later, I actually got to stay at the Kaufman Desert House and celebrate my 11th birthday. And 75 years later, I got to stay there again with the new owner because I was asked to give a lecture like this at something called Palm Springs Modernism. And the owners happened to look at this photo in a way that I had never done. She noticed that what the dishes were, because these dishes had come down with the house and they were still there. So she gave my wife and I a set of these dishes to take away that I had eaten this chocolate cake on 75 years before. And then last year, I was invited to Falling Water, and I'm standing here with one of our advisors who is the great nephew of Kaufman, And then I was recorded having a conversation with the curator of Falling Water. So why am I not an architect? So this is what I looked like when this book came out. I'm there with my high school sweetheart and my father at a boarding school in Ojai, California. And interestingly enough, my wife, Peggy, also went to that school. So this is Peggy with the white thing, and I'm Petruchio in the Taming of the Shrew. So, and anyway, I read this book, and I was inspired by the idea that you could have an evidence, you could learn about the brain and architecture, and so I ended up going to medical school, and my first assignment was to work on the Navajo Indian reservation as a general doctor. And in the morning, in the evenings, and the weekends, I would deliver babies and set broken arms and do all those things. But in the afternoon, I was the public health doctor, and I had to keep track of all the patients who had been treated for tuberculosis and make sure that the people who had been treated for venereal disease were checked up on and so forth. So I was sent off to a special course on tuberculosis control. And one of the days was devoted to epidemiology, which in my training at McGill Medical School in Montreal, we never had anything about epidemiology. We just had a little bit of statistics from a very tired old gentleman who barely understood what it was about. And one of the papers that we read was about a randomized trial of treatment in Bangladesh. Half of the villagers were sent away to a sanitarium for 2 years, and half were visited by a barefoot doctor or a nurse-like person, not even a nurse, who made sure that they took their tuberculosis pills every morning. And at the end, they evaluated how the cure rate for tuberculosis, they evaluated how much it cost, and they evaluated how acceptable the experience was for the patient and the family. Well, they were actually did better at home, and of course, it was much cheaper and it was much more acceptable. And I said, this is what I want to do. So in some ways, it mapped on to my father's approach to architecture, that he was interested in designing for a broad range of people, not just Edgar Kaufman, but also social housing and schools and clinics and so forth. And that he thought that you could get evidence about what worked, just as you did in public health, and that it would be that there were things that were good in architecture that people would resist because people are used to living as they've always done, but there are better ways of doing it. Well, similarly in public health, we tell you to practice safe sex, and we tell you to not smoke and to eat more healthily. So there was a very similar set of things, and also it's an interdisciplinary practice. So I taught at universities, and then for 30 years I worked at the California Department of Public Health in occupational and environmental epidemiology. So that's why I'm not an architect, but why there is a relationship to what I grew up with. So this is the three things about the past. Now we're going to talk about the present and future. So in 1962, when I was in medical school, my father started this nonprofit, and he hoped that somehow his reputation would bring in money to support environmental psychology and physiological research about the environment. And that did not work out. And then my brother took over in 1970, and until 2019, it was more about preserving the legacy and sharing the legacy. But when he died, my brother left a major bequest to us, which suddenly makes it possible to do things. And so I'm going to tell you about that. And we are what is called an artist-endowed nonprofit. And what we value is advancing the preservation of beautiful things and valuable ideas, and doing artful, research-inspired design for people and the planet, which we're going to call responsible design. And so responsible design is either focused on people and their special needs, and we're all different, we all have different needs. Now we have this planetary climate change, and there's all kinds of issues there. And doing research about those things and seeing what works. So we pay attention to what people do, how they socialize, and their well-being and their health. And my father got started on this reading in 1910, this book by the first physiological psychologist, Wilhelm Wundt. And my father was convinced that we'd spent hundreds of thousands of years in an African temperate climate, and that we had deep responsivity to this, and that it was important for being good for people. So his work are famous for fitting into nature and for giving nature center stage in the design. And this starts with the 1929 Lovell Health House, whose glass was a special kind of glass that let UV light in, because in those days there was some rickets was a vitamin D deficiency, and this was to do that. The UV light was supposed to kill the TB germs that could be blowing around, and the walls were washable so you could get the TB germs off. So there was already this concern about health and research and what have you. And this 1928 apartment had balconies and access on the upper floors to the outdoors. And in my house, this is what that balcony on the second floor provided this functional relation indoors and outdoors, even on an upper story. And in the Miller house, which had this little pool, you can see the reflections on the roof here, that you're introducing a continuously changing reflection of what's going on outside. And my brother, in the early 70s, designed this beautiful library with access to the outdoors and with greenery growing inside. And this was applied to apartment design, so that even in apartments you would have this excess. He was also fascinated by small spaces, and in my opinion, some of his best houses are these really small ones. And so here's my favorite room in the place that I grew up with. It's almost like a ship's cabin. There's a place for everything, so you don't get surrounded by your stuff. And there's a mirror there above the desk which doubles the apparent size of the room. And social housing, early studies of prefabricated schools with access to the outside. This is 1934. And then he designed a whole series of schools in the early 40s in Puerto Rico with openings to the outdoors. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. And this experience was written up in a Brazilian book, Arquitectura Social, which got read all over South America. A lot of Mexican rural schools look very much like Neutra schools. And some of the techniques for capturing the breezes then show up in some of his California houses. This is the 1948 Tremaine house, and those windows above the beam and above the cross beam and between the other beams are operable, and the wind blows the hot air off the ceiling. And then in his travels in South America, he discovered Hardo and Kurchan's vertical louvers and adapted them in the Kaufmann house and used giant louvers on public buildings. So once again, people, planet, and research. So the first mission of the Institute is to preserve and share the Neutra legacy. And why? So that more people can be delighted by it and more people can be stimulated by the ideas. And who is it for? Well, it's for researchers and fans, owners, preservationists. So this is a more typical kind of mission with a typical kind of audience. But that original idea was that we would be offering our endorsement in our spaces to help people who are doing responsible design now. And ultimately, the idea is that if we celebrate them, the people who decide what gets built will start to ask architects to think this way. Because right now, for monetary reasons and maybe even aesthetic flamboyance, sometimes those things get neglected. And the legacy isn't only my father, it's my brother and my mother who was very central to this practice. So our assets are the three buildings that we have and the fact that they're embedded in a cultural district, which I'll tell you about. Then we have the intellectual rights to 4,000 linear feet of archives at UCLA, 2,000 of which have been cataloged and 2,000 not yet. And then, of course, the Neutra brand or the Neutra name. So the buildings are three Neutra-designed apartment structures in the Silver Lake district of Los Angeles and embedded in this Neutra colony that I'll tell you about. So the first building is the 1949 Reunion House with its apartment. And this is what it looks like from the outside and the inside. And this is the apartment above the garage. Then the next one is the 1950 commercial office of Neutra with two apartments at the back and a garden. And this large drafting room. And the third one is the 1982 Dion Neutra triplex called Treetops. And so, of course, we maintain this, but we also do some restorations, and we try to follow the highest standards of restoration. And then we try to make educational use of it. So, for example, the USC School of Architecture provided a restoration plan for one of the buildings. And the Getty Research Institute, Preservation Institute, every year has preservationists from all over the world come to Los Angeles. And last year, they came and spent 2 weeks at our campus and developed a plan for it. And they're coming back, they liked it so much they're coming back again next year. So in restoring the thing, we try to advance the field of modernist restoration. And then, as I say, we were part of the Neutra colony of 9 houses. It turns out that my father learned that some vacant land down the street from where he lived was about to become available for sale. And he and a friend bought this land, and they only sell it to people who agreed to build Neutra houses on it. So from 1948 to 1962, gradually these properties were built. And so this is what it looks like. And then down the block is the Neutra VDL studio and residences where I grew up, and that was given by my mother to Cal Poly Pomona. And so we cooperate with them on projects. And so this is the district. And it's a little bit like the area outside of Chicago where you have a number of individual Frank Lloyd Wright houses. So this is not social housing, it's not standard. Each one of these houses has a different family and a different problem, and it's all there. And the question, and so it is an immersive educational opportunity. And our plan is not only to explain it in historic terms, but emphasize some of the enduring design challenges of climate, of family life, of relation to nature, and so forth, that these illustrate and are relevant to design today. And around our buildings, we have QR codes that with your smartphone, even though you can't go inside the building, you can have a virtual walkthrough, or you can see a little video either about the sociological consequences that we're being aimed at or the physiological consequences. And then we remind people that apartment living is an important typology, and that there are apartment museums all over the world that they can go to, and then some of the other multi-family structures in the immediate neighborhood. There are a bunch of really interesting Schindler apartments in that same neighborhood. So then again, our mission, preserve and share the Neutra legacy, and then offer our spaces to promote and our brand to promote responsible designing. And even in our use of the archives for exhibitions and blogs and so forth, we will try to not only talk about the past, but also talk about design challenges of the future. So for example, if we were to do an exhibition of unbuilt Neutra hospitals, of which there are several, we would try to get some exemplary hospitals that think about people, the planet, and maybe even had post-occupancy evaluations so that people think about designing for hospitals today. And in this focus on responsible design, we don't try to reinvent the wheel because we don't have all that much in the way of resources. But there are other people that are concerned with people or the planet or research who are doing things, and we simply offer our spaces in our endorsement. I was at a workshop on architecture and neuroscience last week in Portugal, and two of the architect developers said that they're trying to develop a consortium of developers who think about more than cheap construction and who are concerned about people, planet, and research. And would we consider offering a Neutra Prize for exemplary projects? And I said, of course, that would be the perfect example of offering the brand to give some support to people today who are doing the right thing. So then the other thing, in the Reunion House, we're offering part of it as a place where a master's student at USC can stay for the year at no cost. And the master bedroom is available for visiting professors. This is Professor Chamberlain, who's a designer, industrial designer, interested in designing for elderly people. And then we can use the space to convene people. Last month, I invited the building science professors of the 5 architecture schools in Los Angeles. Building science people are interested in facades and natural ventilation, climate-related things. And these were people who kind of knew each other, but probably hadn't been in one room together ever. And we just spent the morning talking about what their projects were and how we could be helpful to them. And then in the afternoon, their students came and presented some things to each other in that big drafting room. And we hope to keep doing this kind of thing. But just saying, let's get together and talk is a important function. And then we have presentations. This is a presentation by Dr. Esther Sternberg, who's done research on stress hormones in architectural settings and wrote this book, Well at Work, about her work. She's both a professor at the University of Arizona Architecture and University of Arizona Medical School. And then we have offered our buildings as an object of research. So I showed you the picture of this bedroom of Reunion House. This is the first time that my father used this particular device, which was to have what he called a spider leg, where he has the supporting beam going out and its supporting post is outside the envelope of the house. And then there's a mitered glass corner, which is something that Frank Lloyd Wright first did long ago, at the corner. And so this particular researcher is interested in space perception and also has a device that tracks the eye and sees where it looks. So she took this photograph and then compared it to a series of photoshopped images and got people to rank for space and look where they were looking. So first she did this and said this is a traditional fenestration for a room like that. And then here's the original again. And now look what she's doing. See what she's done? She's put a post at the corner instead of the thing outside. And then she tracked where the eyes were looking and checked the electroencephalogram of what they were doing. Now, she does this all the time, so she doesn't need a Neutra building to do it, but to do it on a Neutra building draws more attention to the methodology and to what she's doing. So we're promoting by facilitating her access to this space. And then architecture students at the University of Arizona are doing a post-occupancy evaluation of this visitor center and community in the Painted Desert of Arizona. And the environmental psychologists at Perkins Eastman volunteered to do a post-occupancy evaluation of ventilation and temperature control in this indoor-outdoor school, which is a laboratory school at the University of California, LA. And then they also gave some thought to how it could be modified so that its life could be extended as Los Angeles gets hotter and hotter. And then some of the talks that we do, we have webinars in cooperation with the San Francisco AIA. So they already have an audience, and we suggest some topics for them to look at. And then the intellectual rights to the archives. This is the kind of thing that's in the archive: photographs, correspondence. Here's a correspondence with Edgar Kaufman, who didn't want to have an overhang on the south exposure of this building, which you would think is kind of a crazy thing to do, but he explained that he's only there in the wintertime and he wants the sun to come in and warm the house, and to hell with the summer because he's not there anyway. And then there are out-of-print books and records. There are wonderful renderings. There are travel sketches, artistic sketches, children's sketches. And one of our advisors has arranged to have greeting cards with quotations from Survival Through Design and architectural renderings to be sold at museum stores. And now we come to the last product of the Neutra practice, which is this pavilion that is a modification of the pavilion on top of the VDL studio residence. And the architect from Catal came to my brother and said, could we work with you to enlarge it a little bit, put it in a bathroom, and make it into a pavilion? And so my brother said yes. And then he died, and I didn't hear anything until last summer. And I was coming on a trip to meet my 16-year-old granddaughter, who was studying Spanish in Zaragoza, and she very much wanted to see the monkeys at Gibraltar. And I said, well, fine, we'll do that. And we'll also stay with a friend of mine in Malaga, and we'll do a day trip to Cordoba and to Granada. But I had an extra day or two, and just then I got an email from Catal. And they said, if you're ever in Spain, we've finally finished this factory-built thing, and it's by our factory in Tarragona, and you could come. And I said, well, funny you should mention it. I have such and such a day free, and I'm going to be there in a month. And he said, perfect. So he invited us, and we got to see this pavilion, which is beautiful. And here is Antonio Navarro, who is the designer for Catal, whose idea this was. And so if you want to, for a few $100,000, you can buy this pavilion. He told me that there was a Saudi prince who wanted 10 of them for his French estate. We wondered whether one for each of his wives, but weren't sure why he needed 10. But anyway, so these are commercial ventures that should go to support the activity of the Institute. And then now we get to the book, Survival Through Design, which when we arranged this, I thought we would have actually have the book in hand, but it's going to be in a few months. And so it's a new edition. And the main issues, and this is so light here, I have to look at this. So there are all kinds of interesting things dealt with in this book. One of them is several chapters about the pros and cons of planning. Now, you people like architecture, so you think, well, it's a no-brainer, you should plan. But this is an ideological issue now, right? You can plan a Trump golf course, but you can't plan social housing, because that would be bad, right? So there are all kinds of issues about planning. And then, even from a religious point of view, Jesus talked about the flowers in the field. I don't know how you say it in that quotation in Spanish, that neither toil nor worry, right? So maybe you shouldn't plan at all, but just go with the flow. So he talks about that a lot. And then, of course, he believes that evolution means that we should have nature-near designs, and he talks about that. He thinks that research can be useful. A lot of people are worried about that. It would be just designing by the numbers, but he was inspired by all this stuff that he And then, unlike his mentor, Otto Philotas, who said the job of the architect was to create moods, conscious moods, he says, yes, that's true, but there are also physiological consequences that you have no idea that it's doing this. And that these results affect all kinds of different organs. It's not just mood, but your blood pressure, your stress hormones. And so the multidisciplinary team has a deep responsibility. And that, in a nutshell, that's what this book says. This book is a passion project of this particular gentleman who's an obsessive compulsive, and that everything is beautifully done. It's going to have a preface by the scholar Barbara Lamprecht, and it will deal, among other things, with how it was received by lay people at the time, and all kinds of book reviews are quoted there. And then many architects, like Philip Johnson, said, but Richard, this is not architecture. Architecture is about beautiful monuments and not all this other stuff. Then it's going to have an index, which the original one didn't have an index. And my father was played fast and loose by, Dr. So-and-so said, but didn't say which page or which so forth. And so David Lane has gone and run down the citations to more than 70 different scientists. Interestingly enough, Freud is mentioned only once, but more as an anecdote about that my father went to his office once. So this isn't about Freudian psychology, this is about physiological psychology. And so these are how the citations are there, on the side. And then there will be embedded color photographs, color in black and white renderings, travel sketches, family photographs, and there are more than 200 of them embedded throughout the book. Now, we're told that students don't read books anymore, but when forced to by their professors, they will read a chapter. And so on our website, we are offering a free PDF of one particular chapter that students can download and read. And why this particular chapter? Well, it gives good examples of the kind of brain physiology that he's talking about. And shows that he's thinking not only about how you're thinking, for example, wayfinding or something like that, but all these autonomic effects, blood pressure, blood sugar, and so forth. And that everything is influencing everything else. Like he makes the case in this chapter as he does in many others. And then this particular chapter has a practical application of physiological design with regard to ventilation and thermal control. And it comes, he must have written this when he was in Puerto Rico designing these schools. And he, instead of having a very high typical design, which was even required by regulation then, he has this low slung thing with catching the wind, and he talks about how it blows the germs away, and 4 air exchanges every minute. And then he also talks about the fact that these are small footprints, but then he opens it up so that you can teach outside. And then he talks about the reinforced concrete and the hurricanes and the earthquakes. And so it's a pretty practical example of how he's thinking. And so that's why we chose that. So we put a lot of effort in the website. And last year, 14,000 people came and looked at it, and this year, 48,000 people came and looked at it. And as you would expect, most of them want to see the pretty pictures. And when they click on that, they come to this page, which they can search by the name of something, or if they want to see schools, they can see it. And so we have all the projects that Julius Schulman took pictures of with all the photographs he ever used, even if they were never published. So this, you can get this at the Getty library, but this is a very easy way to see them all displayed. And then there are other parts to this website. So about 2,000 people come and want to know about the Institute, and hundreds are downloading this chapter, and hundreds are going to the resource section that has recorded webinars and all kinds of information for someone who wants to go in at more depth. So for example, we have a session on lessons of Viennese social housing for Los Angeles, and this was one of the lectures that were there. There are a whole series of lectures, some of them about the past, some of them about design challenges today. Now, when I say the Institute did things, this is me and these people. It's all volunteer and passionate people. Sian is our secretary, Michael is our treasurer. They both have degrees in preservation. James Wise is a retired environmental psychologist who's been setting up sessions that we sponsor at scientific things on environmental psychology and neuroscience. And Catherine is a communicator who advises us about how to communicate. So this is all wonderful, very exciting for an 86-year-old guy to be surrounded by all these interesting and dedicated people, but it can't go on like this forever. And so we're having a 5-year plan of, we've got to find, we have enough money to take care of these buildings, which is often not the case with historic buildings, but we don't have enough money to hire someone like Anna to be an executive director, and that we're going to have to do that. I said our strategy is to keep looking for partners, and then some of them see some benefit of either using our spaces or having our endorsement. So that has to happen. Succession plan to replace me as president with someone who's passionate about it. My children, my brother's children are sympathetic, but they're not going to be. And we need to have a small board, but a board that also raises money, but also cares about the two missions. And we need to hire an executive director. So this is what the next 5 years is all about. And what we've covered, I talked about the centennial, I talked about what it was like, I talked about why environmental epidemiology and how architecture, and what the Institute has been doing and where it wants to go. I'm looking for questions.
That was amazing. Thank you, Raymond. That was really very nice to listen to you, and you have covered all this, all your family memories, but then brought to our memory all these beautiful buildings which we all used to study, and we can still learn about them. And they are so and the philosophy of all these, putting people in the center, that's so important still today. So we can, even if maybe we learned with those buildings when we, I don't know, whoever, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, but today we should kind of go through this again. So happy that you came. I see lots of people here, so there's probably someone who would like to make a question to Raymond. I don't know if somebody wants to postulate for the position of executive director or any other. So the floor is yours now. If,
Let me ask a question. Raise your hand if you're an architect. So good. We have some non-architects here too.
So we can center in the non-architects first, please. No questions? Everything was clear?
So I'm curious about how the relationship with Catal started and well, what was their experience, how long it took to ideate and work with them. I don't know. If you can explain a little bit more about that, it would be great.
My relationship to what?
With Catal, the company?
Oh, Catal.
Yeah.
It was really, they reached out. They reached out to my brother, and I really had nothing to do with that. It happened before he died, and they reached out to him, and then they cooperated. They came and visited, and then they cooperated at a distance with. It's about 1/3 larger than the original, and it has, where there was only a closet, it has this bathroom.
So if I get it right, it's something they built following the plans, or was it designed for people in Tarragona? I mean, that device, that pavilion in Tarragona?
Yeah, but that's just a demonstration. The idea that they, if you want to have one of these, you pay them and they come with a truck and assemble this thing there, put in the pool and everything. The whole thing is all part of it, and that's part of the service. So it was interesting that in one of the chapters of Survival Through Design, my father talks about the fact that back in the day, the person who designed something was on site and was talking to the workers, and there was a very tight relationship, and he was watching how things went. But now it's the people with a white collar comes up with drawings, and those are sent to the people in the field, and there's not this connection. But if you do it in a factory, then once again the designer and the people that are doing it were there. And I was struck that when my granddaughter and I got the tour, we were introduced to the technician who's a high school graduate, but a genius of figuring out how to make things work. And he was very enthusiastic, and they had a lot of fun together. And so it just illustrated the point that my father made.
We will get in touch with them to get to know more. We will share with you
Antonio
all.
said he was going to come to this thing, but I don't think he's here. No.
Question, Mr. Neutra. They always say history repeats itself. I can speak out loud. So they say history repeats itself, but what do you think is the reason why mid-century modern is so popular? What is the real reason behind that? Is it the beauty?
Well, one thing that happened was, I guess it was 20 years ago, there was a big exhibition of the case study houses in Los Angeles. And that, at that point, you know, we'd been through postmodernism and all kinds of other isms, and people kind of rediscovered it. Now I think I hear people talking about not only the style, but the intentions at that time of trying to have specially designed houses that were meant to be economic and be available and affordable. And, but I think that what we're seeing is not so much of that. I mean, that we're seeing a lot of celebration of restoring some of these buildings. I don't know how it's playing out in Spain. Are you seeing an effect of California mid-century? Because it really is pretty much California, but a lot in Mexico and in South America, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just one question about the people that you don't mention in your beautiful lecture. Is the Dutch people, VDL, who is an important link between Europe and California, I think?
Yeah. In that book, Barato y Endeble, Frank Lloyd Wright and Neutra, I go into that a lot. Natasha, who's here with Iconic Houses, put your hand up, Natasha, introduced me to a number of people there, in particular Jan Mollema, who's a historian, and I came to understand that not only Neutra and Schindler were impressed by Wright, but the Dutch architects were very much influenced by him as well. And for some reason, most of them were not celebrated in the 1932 MoMA exhibition. So they kind of are not taught about in American architectural history so much. And so in 1930, my father made a round-the-world trip because there was no work to be had in California anymore because of the crash in 1929, and he had some money in his pocket from the Lovell Health House. And he had written these two books that were widely read in Europe. And he got a telegram from someone named Kees van der Leeuw who wanted to talk to him. And my father assumed that he was a Dutch journalist. He didn't know anything about van der Leeuw. And when van der Leeuw showed up in his Duesenberg car, it was clear that he wasn't a journalist, but in fact he was an industrialist. And interestingly enough, he was also a theosophist. And the theosophists in the early 20s expected that the young Krishnamurti was going to be kind of a second coming of Christ, and that they should be prepared better this time than the first time around. And so Kees van der Leeuw was going to be responsible for management worker relationships, and his brother was going to be responsible for housing and so forth. So the Theosophists built a bunch of modernist buildings. There's a beautiful Theosophical temple in Amsterdam, and housing in Omen, and then Kees van der Leeuw built his wonderful factory with all kinds of attention to worker well-being. And so my father was invited to come and meet all those people. He met Rietveld, he met Douker, and some of the others. And they all went to the Siam meeting and so forth. And he really hit it off with van der Leeuw. And a year later, van der Leeuw came to Los Angeles to talk about worker designs for workers, and probably also to visit Krishnamurti in Ojai, whose followers founded that school where I showed you that picture of me in Ojai. So he came, and my father showed him the Lovell Health House, he showed him that apartment house, he showed him other things that were going on. And at the end of the day, he asked my father where could he see my father's house, assuming that he had designed it. And he said, well, I just rent a house, I don't have the money for that. And van der Leeuw pulled out his checkbook and said, how much do you need? And ended up loaning my father, accepted a loan at standard rates for about half the value of a typical house. And in the archive, you can see the letter where he finally pays this off after World War II. And van der Leeuw says, don't give it to me, give it to some foundation that he was involved with. So there is a relationship between my father's work and Dutch modernism because they both descend in some ways from Frank Lloyd Wright.
So I'm wondering about, I understood at the site where the Barnsdale House is in
Hollyhock House, yeah.
Hollyhock House, right. So that there was a plan to have a school and that it was started by, because Wright designed it, and then Schindler, because Neutra was working, your father, with Schindler at the time, that there's just a little bit of wall in the garden that maybe was built and was said that this is really an incredible wall because all three, Wright, Schindler, and Neutra, had something to do with building.
I think that's true. And my father was supposed to do some of the landscape designing for, this is a Frank Lloyd Wright, very large, beautiful building, sort of in his more decorative Mayan phase for Elaine Barnsdall. And then she had a falling out with Wright and finished some work with Schindler, and then my father showed up, and I think Schindler got him a job as the landscape, working landscape on it, yeah. There was someone over here that wanted to say something.
There was someone up there also? Go there and then Elena and then maybe...
Okay.
Hello, good evening, Mr. Neutra. An architect speaking too, of course. Thank you for the talk. I would like to give you an answer to your question and a question. To your answer, if there's the mid-century, it's a thing today and in Spain. I would say that as a perspective, as a professor, I think that our students see and our clients see the mid-century style as an image. Yeah, we like interiorism, we like the color, we like the feeling, but I think we're not brave enough to get the real architecture from that point of view, because that is accepting that we go to, how we say, like more light architecture. You don't go to density, and I think the architecture today still especially in housing and individual housing is still very dense, a bit tacky, and we want to have the maximum square meters we can still build. And this architecture is totally something more light, more adapted, and I think that we are not there still in Spain. I hope maybe someday we'll go back to that, but I don't think we're there. And my question is how with that legacy you could not convince your grandsons or other people of the family to get involved in?
I'm sorry, I had difficulty understanding. Can you say your final question really slowly?
How could you not convince anyone on your family, your grandsons, to get into the project? No, you said that your grandsons, don't want to get involved to lead with the project.
At this point, there doesn't seem to be an interest to take leadership. It's possible that my sons are still working. It's possible when they get retired, they might get involved. I think they will have some contribution of family history and so forth. I have a 14-year-old granddaughter who is asked to be taken on a Neutra tour for her grandfather-granddaughter tour in Los Angeles in June, and she's also interested in cinematography, so maybe she may get involved later. But I think it's great to have input of family, but if this legacy has, as I think it does, a lasting importance, then it shouldn't simply require family to keep it going. There's no little Da Vinci's that are keeping the Da Vinci legacy going. I guess there never were any Da Vinci's, but. Did you have a question?
I can just shout. It's like close. Thank you. So, thank you for a fantastic. It is, yeah? Yes, okay. So, I'm an architect also, yeah. But my mother was a doctor, so I have kind of a both legacy. We have an important discussion in Barcelona about preservation and protection of the heritage of modern movement, and especially of architecture that is not like old modern movement from 20s, 30s, but rather mid-century modern. So I wanted to ask you, how are Neutra buildings conserved? Are they protected? Are they on the list of national heritage? Or is it mostly the work of your foundation to protect that legacy? And especially those that are newer, not so famous, no? Because your father and brother, after all, left like a wide range of buildings and typologies and so on. So
yeah.
Does the state help?
One of the things that we've done is cooperate with some owners who've created a Neutra owners and stewards for civic and commercial projects, a network. And the idea is that they will share with each other practical information about, good contractors or where you can get old fixtures and things like that to retain it. It's even if something is listed, it's no guarantee. I had a nice meeting with Alvaro Siza last week, and he told me that when he was a student, his professor said that you clearly know nothing about architecture. You need to go down and get some magazines and look at things. And so he got 3 copies of 1949 L'Architecture Aujourd'hui, one of which was about Neutra. And I told him I know that particular issue because a building that I inherited, which is a triplex near UCLA, was on the cover of that magazine. Very nice Schulman photograph. And because I'm leaving this to my 2 sons on the East Coast, I did something called a facade easement, which means that the Los Angeles Conservancy owns the surface of my building, and I had to pay them big bucks so that they can keep checking on that building, and anybody who wants to do anything to that building has to notify them as co-owners of the building. So that's about the most protection you can give. Now, there's a building, or was a building, near where I live in Monterey, California, about 2 hours drive south of San Francisco on the coast, and there was a beautiful Neutra building right on the Pacific. And an Iranian tech billionaire bought it with the idea of tearing it down and getting a Legoretta house built on the place. And the local conservancy people decided to hire Barbara Lamprecht to write a nomination as historical, and the state accepted this as a state historical property. And it would have been eligible for the national level, but that requires the Iranian billionaire to agree to it, which of course she did not. And about a year after this, people at the county came and looked at the house, and it was all sagging, and the lady said it must have been vandals had come with and spent 3 hours with a chainsaw cutting through all the supports of the building. And finally, we kept resisting, but finally the local politicians sort of threw up their hands and she tore the thing down. So even though it was listed, that was no protection. So we try to go in the positive direction and encourage and celebrate people that did a good job. And but we're not set up to have a lawyer go and fight each and every one of them. And it's an interesting challenge, isn't it? Because is every single one of these houses, and some of them, for example, the Lovell Health House and that apartment are both being restored, and Barbara Lamprecht is overseeing that, and it's being done very carefully. That apartment is going to be used as affordable housing, subsidized housing, and the Lovell Health House was bought by the Hauser and Wirth gallery people, and they've bought it for $10 million and are spending about $12 million in the restoration. So some of them are done they're searching all over for the bathroom handles and everything of the same vintage, and there's a whole market for that. Then other houses, it's really the exterior that is retained, and maybe the kitchen and the bathroom are changed quite a bit. So, yeah.
Well, that's really a challenge, but what you do, which is dissemination, is what we can do, right? It's what society loves will survive, and if society is not able to know, is not able to love, then it's not able to save. So thank you very much for the job you're doing, and thank you very much for coming to share tonight. Thank you.